think we're starting up, giving it just a second to get going. Okay, it looks like we're live now. I don't think I have any extra sounds on or anything, so we should be good to go. Welcome, everybody. Oh, I do have sound going. There we go. Let's mute it. So again, welcome, everybody. Kyle's on here with me. Like the description says, or the title says, we're going to be talking about networking in Unity, specifically high-performance networking stuff, but also just answering questions that you guys have about Unity networking or just game networking in general. There's a form down below where you can submit questions. For this call, also taking super chats for questions, and all that money is just going straight to Kyle, just as a thank you for answering our questions and helping everybody out. So if you guys have something that you want to bump to the top of the line, or you just want to say thanks to Kyle for all his awesome info that he's about to share, feel free to send those over. And like I said, just going to send it all directly over to him afterwards. Also, before we get going, don't forget to like and share the video everywhere that you can, so that we get more people in here, more interesting questions, and more fun, cool answers. I guess I'll do a real quick intro for Kyle. I've known Kyle for a very long time. He's an amazing C# and Unity programmer, and he really specializes in, or at least amazing at, networking code. He's used a ton of the different libraries. He's built all kinds of networking stuff. And I've seen some of the systems that he's built, and they're super high performance, really just kind of awesome, like the exact kind of thing that you would want. Like if you wanted a network engineer to work on your Unity project, Kyle would be the guy, but he's taken. You can't have him, so don't try. Anyway, with that all said, I'm going to have Kyle's going to share his screen real quick, and we've got the sheet of all the questions. Again, if you want to bump your question up to the top, just pop in a super chat and I'll read it off to him, and we'll go through them and just start answering them. So welcome.
Thank you for that intro. That was wonderful. I'm blushing.
Well, I think you deserved it, man. Everybody's really excited about this. I think we're going to have a lot of people in here, and hopefully everybody's going to get a lot of value out of these questions that we've got and just the answers to them. So I think your screen should be sharing right now, and
hopefully
start kind of going through them. We're both in the sheet right now. So I don't know, where do you want to start? You want to start with just the first question?
Yeah, let's do it. And if you've got answers too, I mean, you've done lots of networking stuff, especially some of the stuff related to databases. I think you're far more experienced with database questions than I am. So I think this is a two-pronged question, actually, partially database and partially socket library oriented, right? So
the top
how do you
one
how do you keep a game state consistent in a big game? Part of that is going to be having a robust database to persist all of your game state data in, right? And the other one is going to be a nice, clean interest management system. So your big game world that exists on a server isn't being entirely transmitted down to a client in one go. You will only be sending relevant information that's near a client down to them. So the trick would be is when something enters a client's relevant set, that you can gather all of the data about that object and send it down to the client at that point, right? So part of it, persisting data to a database when the server actually closes. And the other part is, how do you choose what data to send to a client when an object enters their range, essentially, right?
Right. And how do you keep track of those ranges? What do you recommend for that?
There's lots of options. I think the easiest way is a 2D grid, right? Where you have cells that things exist in. Another option is like a quad tree. And if you need that verticality in your space breakup, you can look at like an oct tree. So you get separation in the y-axis as well as x and z. I think generally for most games, though, especially MMOs, a 2D grid cell breakup of your world where things just exist in a sort of cell is good enough and it's fast enough. You get really quick queries into a 2D grid that way.
Yeah, that's what I've seen too. That, and just like you said, quad trees sometimes, but I don't know that there's always a big benefit.
No, I wouldn't say huge benefit. Especially for distance culling, at least, you don't generally need that granularity. You just want to have a really coarse way of saying, am I near this thing or not, very quickly.
Right. I think that's a good answer. You want to go on to the next one? Yeah,
let's do it. Resources. What resources are there to learn programming effective networking code? Honestly, there's not a ton out there. I think that's one of the big things. This is a problem I would say for programming in general, once you get past the basics of something, it's difficult to find good information. You'll get lucky maybe. I don't have anything specific. It's really just you run into a problem and you find little tidbits of information here and there about that one problem, and you have to kind of put it together yourself. There's not a lot of great resources out there, especially for networking, high quality net code. It's just, yeah, I'm sorry, there's just not a lot out there. I think that's where Jason might come in here a little bit later with some high quality material.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a whole lot out there either.
Mm-mm.
I know that, like you said, there are a lot of really good articles. Like Valve had some really good ones.
Yeah.
I remember reading, and
Yeah,
a couple other ones, but they're not really just Unity specific. Was the thing. Almost none of them are Unity related at all, or Unity examples.
Any of the good stuff is going to be pretty dated. A lot of the techniques that are used these days, like client server implementations, are stuff that's been perfected back in like the Quake 3 days, Quake 3 Team Arena. So that's the same kind of stuff. Like if you're talking about hitbox reconciliation and entity interpolation and things like that, the Valve article knocked it out of the park a long time ago, and it hasn't really been improved on too much since for public consumption. Yep. We need more content, really. That's all it boils down
Totally
to.
Agree. We need to do lots of videos on networking stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a good topic to do videos on. There's not a lot out there.
Yeah, totally agree. And if you guys want to see more of those videos, make sure you hit like, because I want to get that number up high. So you know that networking stuff is super important. Yeah, okay. You want to hit the next one?
Yep. I've been looking at buckets and AWS for a lot of gaming features. Real-time connections is one thing. Plenty of questions there, but I'm sure a lot of people also have plenty of questions on that. But what are some ways to make leaderboards and share non-real-time gameplay data between clients? Well, really, this is where backend as a service comes in for me. I've never really had to implement raw leaderboards myself. We've always been on a platform like Steam or using some backend service like GameSparks or PlayFab, where these APIs are handled for us. It's generally so simple that you don't even think about it these days. I don't have a great answer for that, but that's probably realistically what would happen most of the time in a bigger production, is you would just end up using a backend as a service.
Yeah, that's what I would go with too. I mean, I think that's kind of what he's looking at there, is using some sort of or AWS's. And yeah, I built some before, but I wouldn't recommend doing it unless you really have to build your own.
Yeah.
Just, so
there's a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and it's easy to mess up, like I said. And
Yep.
the other ones are scalable, and they tend to be really cheap and just work for whatever platform you're on. So there's just no reason not to just use those. So use the ones that are out there, I say. Whatever works for whatever you're deploying on. Okay. Here, I'll read off the next one.
Sure.
It's a nice long one. Let me see. It said, what is the best network architecture for game and user persistent data, like how the client connects to the API or the game server API and the backend for an MMO game? Should I use an API call every time the player wants to make a change, like a HTTP GET to get the player data or validate the user data, or on the server or the databases? This is an interesting one. I'd say you definitely aren't going to be using HTTP GET, but you want to just kind of dive into what you would recommend for an MMO, like logging in, getting the data down, and all the other stuff.
Yeah, so it sounds like potentially having a split in databases here between the game server and persistence. Would you agree that's what is being talked about, or am I off on that?
Possibly, but I think that what they're talking about here is more like the login data. So they're logging in and they get player data, and then they're sending out persists to save it. But I mean, really, they shouldn't be sending out anything to save from the server or from the
That's what I'm thinking too. Yeah.
And really, you also don't really do a get to get player data unless it's like a web-based game or an asynchronous game, right? Or yeah.
It also depends. It does the persist. It depends on the architecture a lot, right? Is this a distributed MMO where the databases live? Are there lots of game databases that are decoupled and one central one for persist, or it's it's tough. I guess I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I would say, to answer, I wouldn't use an HTTP GET every single time. That's for sure. You would want to hopefully have your persist near the game database, right? So most of the data, the game data that the server is going to be hitting in the database is going to be local already. That's not going to be something that you want to send network requests for every single time.
Yeah, well, and I think his database question was about validating user data, where you should validate that. Should that be in the game server or the database?
Well, game server. Any data validation is going to want to exist in the game server for sure.
Totally agree. Yeah, trying to validate it in the database is just going to make it more confusing and cause other problems, because then your game server's out of sync with database and stuff's not going to work right.
Right.
Cool. Then the next one was, how can a game like World of Warcraft track all records easily over the network so fast? Like how they track achievement progress and quest progress. And here, I think the bigger thing that they're tracking that's really fast is player locations and combat and stuff that's going on, right?
Definitely.
The the tracking achievement progress and quest stuff is relatively lightweight data. You're just saving off like what IDs of things are unlocked and what ones aren't, and sending that up to the client, maybe sending them up the quest info the first time they get it and caching it locally, and then just sending up the progress status as a % or a byte that's got the data on it. But the sending the network stuff over, or the position stuff's a lot harder. You want to talk about that real quick?
Sure. I mean, that's going to be, a game like World of Warcraft is actually weirdly built on TCP as opposed to UDP, which is not the norm, what I would say, for a game like that. That being said, the data coming down in terms of bandwidth for position and things like that is going to completely destroy the bandwidth of anything else. Like your real-time updating data is going to be by far the most data that is being sent compared to anything else. So that is absolutely the part that needs to be the most optimized, and the parts that's more tricky to deal with at a larger scale, in MMO scale, is that the high bandwidth, high frequency repeating data. And that's where things like your newer C# features like span and things like that can really come into play for efficiency and just speed on that server side, and mapping a bunch of unmanaged data to a managed data type and writing to that without any of the overhead of your garbage collection and things like that. It's a big win in terms of server-side performance and being able to push the amount of data that you need to server-side.
Yeah, and that's the span type in C#, right?
That's right, yeah.
Which is, if you guys haven't seen it, it's definitely something that's important for this kind of stuff.
Provides a type and memory-safe representation of a continuous region of arbitrary memory. And it's what a lot of your high-performance serialization will be built on in C# in a modern sense. So it's a newer thing. Not a lot of libraries are using it yet, but if you can incorporate this into your main serialization loop and your packet creation, you'll get some big wins, especially if you're pooling the memory that it's referencing, sort of using your own malloc, your own pool of memory, and mapping that to spans. You can get some huge wins there.
Right. And the biggest benefit there is not having to do those memory copies and not having to worry about garbage collection as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a big thing on the. Somebody's asking if you could zoom in the screen share a little bit. But it's a big thing when you're at that low-level network layer. You don't want your network layer slowing down your game server at all. You want that to be as fast as possible, so all the slow code can be in your gameplay stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You want to have your networking be nearly invisible on your profiler so that you leave yourself plenty of room to implement actually interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. Okay. Let's see. Can you explain best practices for turn-based games like card games and classic Final Fantasy combat versus real-time FPS/RTS, which I think FPS and RTS are also going to be very different.
Yeah.
Like how to keep data traffic as light as possible.
Something like Final Fantasy, I would be entirely event-based. So there would be that would be a good example of like a TCP I would not actually use TCP. Whenever somebody says TCP in a real-time game, I would actually think UDP with an optional reliability layer on top of it, right? I don't think TCP is generally ever really the way to go these days. I think you're going to want to at some point send unreliable data generally, and that's only possible if you're using UDP with an optional reliability layer on top of it. So you have different quality of service options, right? So you can send reliable data or you can send unreliable data. It's underneath the hood, it's all unreliable. Your reliability layer is just, I haven't received an acknowledgement of this packet, so I'm going to send it again until I receive that acknowledgement, right? That's how you do reliability on UDP. But I think for a Final Fantasy game, it would be one of the few exceptions where TCP would probably be the way to go. I don't think you would need any actual unreliable data in that. You would want to do almost purely event-based reaction stuff in terms of how you're networking it. Now, for an FPS, you're not going to do an FPS on TCP. You're going to definitely need UDP for that constant blast of data that's coming down of positions and state update data. You're going to want to have something where you're serializing the entire state of the world into a single packet and compressing it down as much as possible for an FPS, and then delta compressing that as well. So FPS,
keep it fast, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a bandwidth thing. You're going to want to, you've got to hand pack the world state down with the knowledge that you have of how you can pack it down. It's like inputs. You can pack lots of inputs into a single byte, right? And pack lots of frames of inputs into that single packet and send it all in one go. You can reorder. So there's a notion of an array of structs versus a struct of arrays. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Jason.
No.
So one of the benefits that you can get out of serializing an entire world state in one go, if you imagine you have an entity in a world, and the entity has current health, current mana, all of its items, current spells, the state that makes up this entity, right?
Right.
Now, you get wins in serialization for data run-on. So if you have, say you have all of your entities and you order them by health, right? So the entities with the highest health are first, the entities with the lowest health are last. You're going to serialize your entire world state. You walk these entities, instead of serializing health, mana, item, spell, health, mana, item, spell, health, mana, item, spell, right? You're serializing top-down entity 1, entity 2, entity 3, entity 4, and so on and so forth. You serialize all the healths, serialize all the manas. Does that make sense? You serialize all of the items. So you're getting these run-ons. So all of the entities that share the same amount of health, if they're 0, when you run compression over this packet, those get nixed out. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
That's a big win that you can get in terms of world state serialization that way for an FPS, because you generally should be able to fit the entire world state into the MTU, the maximum transfer unit size of a packet, which is generally like 1400 bytes. So if you can pack a world state into a single packet and then delta compress that world state, you'll get massive wins for bandwidth. Now, the problem comes when your world state becomes so big that it doesn't fit into that packet size anymore. And now you're fragmenting that world state packet over an unreliable connection. And if you drop part of that world state packet, the entire thing is garbage. So now you're not able to send this data unreliably without a lot of worry, because now you have multiple parts of this large packet in flight. And if any one of them are dropped, all of that work the server just did is garbage on the client, or you'll have to resend that part of the packet again and again. You just end up with a stall. So that's where an FPS networking model falls apart at large scale, is what once you cross that 1400 byte state threshold, roughly 1400 bytes. It's not exact, but things really start falling apart.
Oh, that's really interesting. Also seems like a nice, easy win too. Like,
Oh, it's a huge win. Oh my God.
yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't seem like it's very complicated to do, and
No.
yeah, you get a lot out of it.
And it's the same conceptually. It's the same idea as ECS.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah.
It's data layout in it's just for a different reason. The data layout that ECS is worried about is for contiguous memory, and the data layout that we're interested in is for bandwidth savings.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
Seems really
And
cool.
then RTS is obviously way different. It's lockstep. So if you look that up, it's a lockstep format. It's actually the old Doom networking model just applied.
Yeah, very, very different when you're building an RTS. It's something that I still want to build sometime. I've never actually set up a lockstep network system before. I've read a lot about them, but I've never had a use case for it that was more than just kind of playing around and example.
Right. Yeah.
I think that it's kind of a really cool way to do stuff. And it's just something I want to do, but it's way, way different than all of the other options, I think.
It sounds like a nightmare to me, having like a fixed point math library or something like that for that reliability and replaying those steps. It's not something, making like a civilization game, right? Over the network. That sounds so difficult. Civilization or Age of Empires. It sounds very, very difficult.
It sounds difficult, but fun.
Yeah, I agree. Oh man, that sounds like a lot of fun for sure.
It's like a fun, but really hard challenge.
Yeah.
Just to remind everybody, if you guys have questions, there's a form in the description. So if you can just submit them there, and we're just kind of going through them one after another, try to get through the whole list. I don't know if we'll make it all the way through, just still a bunch of questions. Also, if you have, if you really want to get a question answered first, you can send super chats and all that. I'm sending that all directly over to Kyle just to thank him for answering our questions. He's answering stuff I don't know the answers to, and a lot of things that people have been really interested in. So really, really, those are awesome. So, and also don't forget to hit like and share and alerts and all that other stuff too. It's always important. Okay. Yeah, we'll just jump over to the next game, or the next question, which was, is it currently possible to have cross-platform games like PC to mobile?
Wait, I think you skipped that one, right? The one before?
Oh, did I? Oh, I did. I totally missed it. It's really unclear what Unity multiplayer is moving towards as a newbie. We still use the default network scripts like network identity transform, which shows it. Yeah. So essentially they're asking about what's going on with the Unity networking. And I don't think either one of us has any inside info on that. We both think that there probably needs to be some replacement for Unit that's plug and play, but I don't think there's anything there yet. I'd be surprised if they don't eventually replace those with something that's high performance and easy to use like that. The Unit system was really built around being really easy to use.
But it was very easy to use.
There are a lot of other options out there that are easy to use though, like Photon, and I don't even want to list them all. There's a lot of them out there though that kind of replace that. I wouldn't use Unet in anything anymore just because it's deprecated and it's definitely going away. So look at building your own, or one of the pre-built ones is probably what I would recommend. What would you recommend for somebody that wants like a new system, like they're new to Unity or new to networking and they just want a simple like plug and play network system? Is there one or two recommend checking out?
I think I would go with Mirror. Honestly, it's if you want ease of use, if that's your main concern, I think Mirror is the way to go. It's it has the benefit of being almost identical to Unet in terms of code. It's built on Unet. It's unfortunately TCP. There is a UDP transport option for it, but I can't really recommend it one way or another. It's the UDP transport option is built on ENet, which is what I personally also use for work and general networking. It's just a low level UDP library with no real application interface. There's no notion of like packet types and things like that, message types. You have to implement all that yourself, right? There's no network views, network identities, all that stuff. It's just a UDP socket layer with optional reliability and the ability to fragment stuff. So like I'd say I'd approach the answer from two levels. If you're brand new to Unity and networking and you just want to build something and you don't really, scale isn't a huge concern to you, I would go immediately to Mirror. It's probably the easiest thing to just get working out of the box. But if you're looking for a long-term solution and a long-term project that could possibly scale, I would probably look at doing something yourself on a reliable, mature UDP library, Lidgren, eNet. There's a few on the forums. I think like LightLibNet looked like it was pretty solid. Haven't used it personally. I would highly recommend Lidgren and eNet to start with if you're going to do something custom though. They're both solid.
Seems like good advice. I haven't played with Mirror at all, but a lot of people had asked about it, so I think that's a great answer. Actually, there were people in chat recommending it too. And what about Mirror? So, then Mirror TCP if you're new, which was kind of what the question was on. So if you're new, try the Mirror TCP, and then I assume it's probably easier to transition from that to their UDP one than some other one, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep.
Well, okay. Well, okay. Now I'll go on to the question that I jumped to and almost skipped the last one, which was, is it currently possible to have cross-platform games like PC to mobile, where you're playing poker or something? The only difference is the input method.
Well, short answer, yes.
Yes, it definitely is. There's really not, unless you're using one of the specific library or a specific network stack for the device, you're totally fine to go cross-platform.
I think it would be more work to make it not cross-platform.
Yeah.
It should just naturally happen.
Totally agree. Yeah, it should be pretty simple to do that. Is it wise to use ECS in multiplayer games? Will it increase performance?
Yeah. Okay. Again, it's a little bit of a caveat, I guess. I wouldn't build your UDP networking layer around ECS. I would use ECS on top of your network layer, though. That's totally perfectly fine. So you have your transport layer where you just send bytes to a person, and that ignore ECS in that. But all of the gameplay code that you want to build, if you're looking to ECSify your game, there's no reason that you can't do that on top of whatever UDP layer that you wanted.
Yep, I think that makes sense. If you're looking at ECS, make sure that you're going to get the benefit out of it, though, and you're not building something that's so simple that you don't need it. It's easy to make things faster than they need to be. Right?
Premature optimization for sure.
Okay, here's another one. If our goal is 1 million downloads, can we use free services for a turn-based game without a problem? It's funny, we were talking about that earlier. I don't know of it. Do you know of any free ones that would scale up to 1 million concurrent users, or I guess not really?
Well, 1 million downloads versus 1 million downloads maybe not even is not even a ton, really. I guess in mobile space, that's
you're probably talking like 10 to 50,000 peak at max.
Yeah, I think you'd probably be okay. It's hard to say, I guess. It really depends on the game, because most of those free backend as a service solutions or systems have API caps or concurrent user caps. So it really depends on what your specific application ended up pulling in terms of API counts and concurrent users. You'd probably be okay, I want to say, especially if that 1 million is not in a single day.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, though, without harder numbers.
Yeah, and I think you got to look at the different options and just look at the pricing. Just assume that your game is going to be successful, and if it's successful, is the cost of that service too much? Like, or does that make you no longer successful? Right? Like, you're getting 1 million installs. Are you losing money, or are you still able to make plenty of money off of it based on your revenue per user there? It's a tough one. See, is it worth the struggle to make an online or multiplayer game, or is it better to make an offline game with ads or in-app purchases? I don't know.
That's pretty subjective.
Yeah, it's making an online or multiplayer game, I always tell people, is about 10 times harder than making a single player game.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
If you're making it multiplayer just to call it multiplayer, probably not. But if you're making it multiplayer because the interaction and experience with other players is the important part, then that's kind of the game design. And I don't know how much money people are making now with offline, with ads in general. I haven't made much money on those ever in my life in games, and I don't know a lot of people who do, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one.
Well, I guess personal anecdote, I barely play non-multiplayer games anymore. Hardly. They just don't hold my attention like a multiplayer game does anymore. Even like the best AAA games that like The Witcher 3 or Skyrim or something like that is supposed to be really engaging single player games, I usually fizzle out like maybe halfway through and hop back on World of Warcraft, League of Legends, or something like that, where it grips me better. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I'm sure it's just me. But I think that is a modern take on games from a lot of gamers is single player games just don't have the same appeal anymore. So that's one reason to seriously look at why you would make a multiplayer game over a single player game these days. It's just far more engaging to certain gamers.
Yeah, I certainly agree. But if you're worried about making money, just remember your multiplayer game is going to take a lot longer.
Definitely.
It's going to cost a lot more to develop. And you got to make it fun. Whatever you make, you got to make it fun enough that people want to play it, because you're not going to make money off of ads or sales or anything if you don't have something that's fun and engaging for people to play. For me, single player games that stand out are the ones with really good story or unique gameplay, or local multiplayer games. I still play a good amount of those, surprisingly.
I watch a lot more single player gameplay than I do play these days. Oh. It's like if a new single player game comes out, I don't generally pick it up. I'll go pull up my favorite streamer, and while I'm working, I'll have a stream up and just watch and sort of passively take in the story and because a lot of the single player experience you get without even necessarily playing.
Yeah, it's all the story stuff that's building up.
It's almost like watching a movie for me at this point.
Yeah, it's like I feel like they're interactive movies a lot of the
exactly
time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As long as they don't have too much boring downtime, I'm good. I can play them, right? It's a good one. Okay, here the next one. What's a benefit of a multiplayer mobile game over a single player offline game? I think we actually just kind of answered that.
That's true. That's very similar.
Could you show how to build an authoritative server using Photon? I don't think that we can show the whole steps for it.
Not on the stream, at least.
Yeah.
Photon is inherently authoritative, though. Even Pun, it's not a peer-to-peer architecture. Even if you're doing player-hosted servers, one of the players is still the authoritative host of the game. So if you're building Photon with an authoritative server in mind, things just sort of slot in. You shouldn't have to do anything extra, I guess.
Yeah, it does make it pretty easy to get started with that and do that. Which is nice. It's just the only thing you have to worry about there is your client being the cheater, or your server host.
Exactly.
Player server host being the cheater, right? But it depends on the game type whether or not you have to worry about that.
And you can easily, if you are using Photon and you do build everything on Pun, so Pun is built expecting the backend to be a Photon server. So you can use Pun and rip out the Photon cloud part of it. And if you eventually need to transition from player hosted architecture to a client server architecture, you can make your own, you can like buy an Amazon box, you can buy Photon Cloud, you can run Photon Standalone, you can run Photon Standalone on your server, and Pun can connect to it just like you're connecting to the Photon Cloud architecture. So you can become a cloud provider on your Amazon box at that point, which lets you host your game on the Amazon box as if the Amazon box was one of your players. So with Photon, eventually, if you have to make that transition to client-server authoritative architecture, you can. And until you need it, you can just have your players do the hosting.
Yeah, sounds good to me. So I think that answers the whole question. I jumped to one more. Let's see. When learning a new skill, it can be hard let me read this up top. When learning a new skill, it can be hard for solo learners to find a neat project to really get to grips with the element of the tech at hand. With this in mind, what Unity project idea? Okay, what do you recommend for somebody who wants to start building a network project and it's their first one? By the way, I was going to ask you, Kyle, is it possible to drag my Zoom window onto the screen somewhere up there? And I can just sit there and wave at people randomly while you're talking? I don't know if that's possible.
It's very small. Can I make you bigger?
I don't know. I was just curious. I saw it up there and it's...
Boom.
Now I disappeared completely. Oh, wait, maybe not. Hold on. Yeah, I don't see me at all now.
You're not living in the top right corner on my screen?
No.
What?
I don't see me. I don't know why.
Oh, no.
No. Maybe it just hides it. I don't know. I'll have to figure it out.
Oh,
later.
I think it must. Yeah, it must. Zoom's like hiding the window.
It is. It's trying to be helpful and it's doing the exact opposite. One of these days, I'll figure out how to set up streams where you can see a bunch of things all the time. But anyway, yeah. So what do you recommend for somebody solo trying to learn how to do networking? What kind of project idea would you tell them to do? They want to make they're like the first multiplayer project. I assume something simple to get.
Yeah, definitely.
I would simple but interesting.
Keep it in probably a different project and experiment outside of your main project, I would think. And really just try to keep things really, really simple. You can really put the cart before the horse, so to say. Like, it's easy to get ahead of yourself in networking and think you've got more done than you have, when you've got to get the basics working. And I mean really, really working in order to build on top of it. If anything starts bugging out at a low level in a networked game, it propagates so horribly that it becomes difficult to identify what the root of a problem even is. So having the lowest level base things working well, and just the basics, getting the basics up and running first before doing other things like networking death and damage and all this stuff, just getting very smooth positions working. I would spend lots of time on that and just get it right and understand what's happening. How does an entity interpolation work? Getting your network time synchronization right and doing some research into how do I synchronize network time properly. Getting the low level stuff that you sort of base other features on, I think is the most important.
And it's actually with like a easy. 2D or 3D game or any
I don't really think it matters that much, honestly. It's just one more axis of synchronization for the network layer, at least. Like, in terms of netcode, I don't think you would find much of a difference at all.
What about animations or non-animation stuff? Would you go with something that doesn't animate or?
Yeah, I would ignore all of that. I would just focus specifically on unreliable position data and displaying that smoothly.
Makes sense.
Researching entity interpolation, state snapshots, and synchronized network time. Those three things, I think.
Sounds like a good idea. Move some tanks around or something at first.
Exactly. Yeah. Or just some capsules, some cubes. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Okay. Let's jump on to the next one. What do you advise for using for networking in Unity? I think you've already answered that one, which was ideally building your own. But if you're starting out, going with something like Mirror and using their TCP to get started, and then maybe jumping over to their UDP system.
Yep.
Okay, here's a good one though. Is it common practice to use both TCP and UDP in a single project at the same time, like TCP for login data and UDP?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is, especially for an MMO sense. So you'll use TCP for all of your. Well, that's not true. Actually, you would use HTTP and UDP for MMO a lot, I guess. So if you were building a game on TCP and you wanted to do voice communication, VoIP over your game, you would probably open an additional UDP socket to handle that data. VoIP and TCP don't go very well together. Resending voice packets never works. So that would be one case. I would say it's less common to use both in a single project, but it happens.
Yeah, I've seen, you're saying both in a lot of projects, usually with like HTTPS or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
keeping it a little bit more secure. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with using both. You're going to see both in a lot of things where you're sending some data in TCP and then doing UDP for other things, for all of the high performance stuff. Just to reintroduce for anybody who's joined late, we're talking about networking, high performance networking stuff, primarily with Unity, but there's kind of general questions that people have about networking in Unity or just in games in general. We're going over questions that are in the form that's in the description below. If you got questions, you can submit them there. If you want them bumped up to the top, you can just send in a super chat, and I'm giving that all to Kyle. So far, we're at 0 of those, but I assume that some high priority questions that they want to ask and just kind of get bumped up. Kyle's a buddy of mine who's been coding networked games for a very long time, made all kinds of different stuff, done awesome network layers for this MMO we're working on now and FPS games and all kinds of stuff. So he's got just great advice on how to build a networked game. So if you guys have network specific questions, again, just drop them in that form or the super chats or whatever. And we're just going to try to answer them as quick as possible and go over and hopefully give you guys some really good advice on how to build games. Also, don't forget to hit like, the little bell thingy, and subscribe, and go share this on Facebook or whatever other things that you're using right now. Okay, go on to the next question. How would you prevent a game room from destroying? How would you prevent a game room from destroying and to do it in a manner that minimizes data usage? I don't know if I understand that question.
I think what they're talking about is when you're using something like Unity's cloud service or Photon's cloud service, where you have these rooms that automatically destroy themselves when people leave. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that's what they're talking about.
That would make sense. So in that case, do you have an answer for that one?
I don't think you can. As far as I know, I don't have a lot of experience using these cloud services. Only a couple, I'd say one project I've ever done used the Unet cloud service, and one project used Photon's cloud service. That's the extent that I have in professional use. So I don't know that you can keep a room open. And if you aren't talking about that and you're talking about it's a client server architecture, it's just as simple as don't close the exe that the server is running on, right?
Yeah.
So I can't imagine that would be. Yeah, it has to be, the question has to be related to the cloud services. So I don't think that it's possible.
Oh, and there was one I skipped. What are usual hurdles when developing cross-platform networking for desktop, consoles, and mobile? I mean, we talked a little bit about whether or not you can do it, and it's relatively easy to do that by default. But I know of at least one really annoying problem. I don't know if you got any.
I can think of one. Let's see what yours is.
The bit EDN crap.
Sure. I actually don't think that's a problem these days, though. Unless you're talking about old hardware. Like if you're looking at targeting seriously old hardware.
I just remember doing it targeting MacBooks and iPhones, and everything was inverted, and it drove me nuts. Okay.
Yeah. The other one I was thinking of is just straight up agreements that you're not able to do, like PlayStation, Xbox cross-platform. You're just not allowed to. Yeah.
Yeah. They just don't allow it legally.
Yeah.
It's kind of a pain. Although I know Microsoft at least keeps talking about making that easier. I don't know what the holdup is there.
There's talks about it. I've seen a couple of game dev articles talking about possibly lifting that restriction, which would be great.
Yeah, I wonder if they're worried about like the game just being easier on one system than the other, and then ruining the experience or something. Maybe. Or if they got some other reasons.
They end up seeing that the players on the Xbox end up doing 15% better than players on PlayStation. And it's just one more thing that you can hold over them kind of deal.
Oh yeah, I could totally see that being an issue. Like, oh yeah, everybody's buying it for the other system now.
And then you get the PC gamers in there just destroying everyone.
Yeah, I remember Halo like that, right? Playing Halo when you could do cross-platform for a while. At least I think it was on Halo 2. You could just destroy people on PC on the console.
It's not really fair.
No, not at all. Okay, thoughts on networking mirror? We already answered that one. You liked it, recommended it. Thoughts and tips with using Photon in Unity. Do you have any like general thoughts on Photon or tips?
I think it's great. Honestly, I think it's overlooked these days. It's a nice middle ground between something like Mirror, which I could look at as sort of like an entry level basic library, and Photon bridges the entry level with sort of high performance, especially the newer versions of Photon. Photon's server, they've improved a lot of garbage allocation related things, and just general performance has improved from what I've seen. I haven't used it in a long time, but I've sort of kept up on the updates and what's changed. Photon, I think, is a good middle ground between high performance and ease of use.
Nice. Yeah, it always seemed pretty easy to use for me.
Yeah.
I wasn't never really sure on the performance. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but yeah, it always seemed like it was really simple to get started with. So definitely a good idea.
Yeah, I've got high praise for Photon.
Okay, so let's see. Not a lot of detailed info for new Unity online multiplayer. Oh, okay. They're just asking about the new networking system. I don't know if either one of us has any specific.
There's really not a lot of info out there.
Yeah, I think
you're right.
The answer is you're correct. There's not a lot of info out there. And my thoughts on it were that I was waiting for them to keep working on it and finalize things more, because I assume it's going to change dramatically. I don't know if you had anything else to add to that.
I've used it 2 different times now. I built a basic project twice. So really early on, I used it, and then they did a big change on how a lot of the drivers and the setup is done, like the boilerplate that's required. And I tried it again, and both times I was very unimpressed and almost worried about the direction that they're going. I don't think that the current networking system that they're working on is going to be very good in its current incarnation. They might have, so the way that they're approaching it is like, this is a networking solution just for FPS games, and then they're going to do one just for MMOs, and then another one just for RTSs. So if that's the case, I'd be more interested in seeing what the general MMO networking looks like, because the FPS networking is far too rigid and has too many, I don't even know what you would call it. It's restrictive in a sense that it can fail silently. Like it doesn't make sense. Some of the design decisions that they've done don't make sense to me. I guess it's the easiest way to put it.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's just not really portable to switch over to other game types right now. Yeah,
it's
and
very
I think
specialized.
It's still a ways out, and we'll see. Like,
yeah, I agree.
How it turns out, it'll probably change dramatically over the next year or two. I wouldn't be surprised if it's totally different in a year. No.
I bet it's actually completely different right now.
Internally, probably.
Yeah, their Git repo is super out of date. They're not keeping it up to date at all. So we don't really have a good idea of what's going on behind the curtains either. This is just my take on 2 uses of the API that both changed very drastically in those use cases too.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like I said, I barely played with it myself, and I just looked at it and it's like, okay, it looked a lot like just a bunch of raw UDP stuff, and
it's exactly
an interesting
like.
example for how to make an FPS game, but it wasn't something that I would recommend just trying to go use out of the box. Or
you're talking FPS sample project.
Yeah, that was the one I played with last.
Okay, that's a lot of stuff built on top of that new network layer too. Yeah, that's true. I wasn't even thinking about that. That project is huge. Yeah. There are some good examples of implementation details in that project though. If people wanted to tear that apart.
But yeah, it's not something I would jump to yet. But I don't think that they're recommending that either. They're still working on it. That's why it's an alpha.
It's not like tutorialized at all, that project. It's very, very messy.
Yeah, I'm hopeful it's going to be really cool when it's all done. And
likewise.
Okay, this one, he says it's a silly question. How do multiplayer games update features? Won't it affect players' saved games? It's not really I mean, yeah. What do you? I guess like the problem here is when you update features and you change things. You know, if your clients are out of sync or your game and server, I'm thinking less like an MMO, but more like a mobile game, right?
Sure.
Like, I would say you just force everybody to be on the same update, and you you basically do some checks when they're trying to connect, make sure that they're on the same version or the correct version, the latest one. And then you have to think about the data. If there's any saved game or data changes, you have to think about and test that migration update. Like,
you'd write a data migration to go from a version to a version.
Yeah.
So
a lot of the time you don't even need that because it's just new data.
You're right. Yeah. If it's just adding data, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If something actually named itself differently or was deleted, then you just write my data is version 12. Here's how we migrate data version 12 to version 13 and run it. And that's it.
Yeah, we had a lot of those. I remember in EQ or EQ2, there was just this big chunk of code that did data migrations from version 1 up to version whatever 20 something that it was on. By the time I left that team for the character data, it's like if it's version 1, it converts to 2, then it goes to 3, then 4, then 5, all the way up to and most of the time everybody's on the latest one. But if somebody had really old data, it could do that migration relatively easily, and it wasn't too complicated to figure out. It was kind of a pain to write it, but it wasn't that bad, I guess.
Yeah,
I'm just complaining.
Sometimes those migrations live server side in terms of like an MMO, and sometimes those migrations live client side for loading save games. So that can exist in a networked or non-networked game.
Yeah. Yep. And I guess it doesn't even matter if it's multiplayer. The multiplayer side, it's really just making sure that everybody's on the same version and connecting to the same version or with the same version, doing something.
Or if you're pulling old persist data from a client that hasn't logged in 3 years or something, then running the migration on him at that point, if it's not done in batch on the entire database.
Right. And ideally just batch update it. That's what I prefer to just do them all at once when you do the server rollout, if you can. Okay, so again, just to update everybody, I see a couple people coming in and asking questions. The videos, this thing will still be available afterwards, so you can watch it later. You can go back through, scrub through, whatever, find answers to the questions. Kyle's got a screen shared. We're going through the questions as fast as possible. There are a lot of them in there. Still taking super chats if anybody's got any questions they want to bump up to the top. And we're just answering network related questions, mostly Unity specific, but also non-Unity things. So if you have questions about building multiplayer games or just online games that are persisting data or really MMOs, stuff like that, Kyle's a great resource for that. He's the guy that I know that knows the most about this kind of stuff. And he's an amazing resource for high performance networking stuff. He's done some really crazy stuff to make games that can scale to thousands of players and run great. So this is the time. Just you can ask the questions down in the forum so that we get to them, or again in the super chats. But also don't forget to hit the like button and see if we can get over 100 at least. Surprisingly, we have a lower number of viewers than usual. I think it's just the time of day. But if we can share it and stuff and get more people in, get more questions, that'd be great. And we'll just keep going from there. All right. So the next question was. I'm making a small network layer for a game, and I'm trying to figure out how to encapsulate the requests to send them to the server in a flexible way. I thought of making a service layer that's used to send commands over the socket, but it would mean creating a new class for each operation, which doesn't seem like the best solution. Any advice to interfacing with the server in general? So I guess he's really asking about, should he make a class for each message? It's kind of what it sounds like. I don't know. Is that what it reads to you?
Yeah, I'm a fan of it. Using message pools and classes, implementing a interface to define a message type.
I totally agree. I like having the message clean.
Yeah, and you can encapsulate extra data in the message and do all serialization and things like that related to that message in the one spot. Now, if you're worried about performance of just creating classes on the fly, you could also look at possibly doing your messages in structs or using a pool, pooling your messages, right? Just a single threaded pool, pull from it. If it doesn't exist, create it, that kind of thing. So our library, we have a message cache essentially, and we can pull from the cache by type, and we do runtime C# code generation to deal with the creation of these types. So if we aren't running in IL2 CPP, so if we're running in mono, we can just emit the code to create these messages once. So it's efficient. It's essentially the same as calling the constructor directly, but we just emit that code once at startup, and then whenever we need to create a new message, we call from that emitted code, as opposed to doing activator.create instance or something similar to that, which is very, very slow using reflection at runtime.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I 100% with Kyle there. Do that. Classes for messages and getting all that set up is by far the cleanest. It's a lot easier to manage and maintain later on. Yeah. It seems like you're writing a lot of stuff, but you're really just making it easier to maintain your project in the long term. Kyle, I'm going to jump over to that other form. I almost forgot it was the Patreon form. It had like 3 questions and just jump through them real quick. The first one was, what are good anti-cheat strategies and tools / packages? Got any?
I don't know about tools and packages. Oh, actually, that's not true. There's that asset store thing. What is that called? Anti-cheat toolkit? Yeah. So this, you can add simple, this is like for the script kiddies. What is that stupid thing called?
The little memory reading.
Yeah, a little memory reading tool that a lot of people use to like change their health and stuff like that. You can hide some variables with that using that. But really, if you're talking about a networked game, which most of these questions should be, you just need an authoritative server. The client can never be in charge of anything.
Yeah. I'd say that's the most important part, is
by far the most important.
Yeah, never trust the client. Always assume that the client is lying, and always assume that everything coming from network data in the client has been hacked and faked.
Yep. Conceptually, the client is a renderer. The client is rendering the server state. All the client is capable of doing in an authoritative server is capturing what keys are held on the keyboard and how my mouse is moving. And that it can be sent to the server. If any other data besides that is being sent to the server, you could consider the game to be hackable.
Except for button clicks and things like that too.
That's what I mean. Like clicking something on the screen. Sure. Keyboard and mouse state, essentially.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. I just want to make sure people didn't think that you didn't mean those things too.
That's fair. Yeah. Clicking like the close dialogue or something like that. That's fair.
Well, there's actually a chat from Robert. He said, thanks very much, Kyle and Jason. Very much appreciated. Yeah, I think Kyle. And he wanted to know if Kyle is working on a network library that can work with Unity that's cross-platform.
Yes, but it's not in the public space at the moment. Initially it was, but all of the work has been pulled into a private repo for my job. So let's see. I want to make it public. The problem right now is the repo has a lot of proprietary assets in it from Pantheon, art and things like that from just testing that I just brought in. So I had to close the repo down for now. But I do have something that I will probably eventually open source. I just can't say when, due to job things.
Yeah, and whenever that does happen, it'll be awesome, because I've seen it, and I've seen the performance out of it with, what was it, like tens of thousands of guys running around?
Oh, hundreds, yeah. At least in
thousands of guys running around, yeah, high performance and just working great. Also, people are asking if you have a channel. I know you had a Twitch channel. I don't know if you're still using that.
No, I'm not doing any streaming at the moment. I've backed off of a lot of the social stuff. I don't even have like a Facebook really or anything like that.
Oh, okay. So this is the only way to talk to him right now. If you guys have really, really good questions for Kyle, you can
add me on Discord, I guess.
Yeah, and I can pass on questions you get if you guys want to bug him. I'll ask him. Cool. Okay. Let's jump back to those questions. And thanks for that, Robert. So what third-party networking service do you recommend? So this would be, I guess, not a plugin, because you'd already kind of recommended Mirror, or not really a plugin, but like your own server solution. Is there like a service-based one you would recommend? Or any?
I'm only aware of Photon, really, right? I mean, Photon, I guess, and Unity's service? Networking, yeah. But Unity's networking is being sunsetted.
Spatial OS, and then
that's true. Yeah. Can you think of any others?
The online ones that are more turn-based or just data state.
The backend as a service kind of thing, yeah. Spatial OS we evaluated a long time ago, before a lot of their big Unity pushes happened, for another MMO, Forsaken Legends. And it was nice, but the workflow at the time wasn't mature enough. You were doing a lot of work in other languages like Scala and doing all of your serialization with protobufs in Scala. And you were doing a lot of work outside of Unity. I believe that the workflow has actually improved quite a bit with Spatial OS and their more recent Unity-centric updates to kind of make that workflow fit in the C# language better and in Unity better. So I think I can give them a recommendation, and that's Spatial OS. I haven't used them in production. That being said, I believe it's very expensive. And I think they're also having some legal issues with Unity at the moment, in terms of how they were selling their licenses. I have to read a little bit more into that, but they might be in some hot water for that as well. But Photon Cloud, very high quality third-party networking service.
I think that they had resolved that stuff, but I don't
know.
I remember there was a big kerfuffle on the forums and stuff about that.
Yeah, I remember reading a little bit about that. I wasn't sure exactly how that panned out.
Yeah, hopefully. I think they got it resolved, but I'm not 100% sure. It's not something I've kept up on. Okay, I'll jump to the next one. So the next one was, I don't want to read the whole question out, but it was just having a hard time understanding the idea of UDP streaming. He understands using it for network positions and that kind of stuff, but wanted to know what other use cases or would you use it for? And I think you kind of mentioned this in sending world, state, and deltas. Can you kind of just, is there more, or would you just want to explain what that means a little bit?
Sure. So there are games that do pure UDP implementations. I think Halo on the console is one of them. And for things that are supposed to be reliable, they actually end up just sending the data twice. And if it doesn't end up getting acknowledged, they send it again. So you can send reliable data over UDP and have pretty good results, especially if you implement your own reliability layer and resend data that needs to actually be there 100%. But the wins that you get from doing this are in terms of packet overhead and bandwidth. So TCP's overhead is quite expensive. It's heavy. There's more data that is sent in every TCP packet. I don't remember the exact header sizes, but the overhead of a TCP packet in general per packet is larger than a UDP packet. So you can implement a custom reliability protocol on top of UDP and only implement the parts that you care about as a game programmer. So you can get wins in terms of that. That's one of the reasons why we use UDP exclusively almost, is for that. Now, if you don't need to send unreliable data, then TCP, that's the obvious choice. It's just, why add extra work if you never need to send unreliable data ever in your whole stack? There's no point. But if you ever want to send that unreliable position data, that's why we have UDP streaming, so that you can send something and not care if it gets there. That just gives you the option to do that. You don't have the option to do that unless you're doing UDP streaming.
And I looked up the size because I couldn't remember it either. And the minimum header size is 20 bytes for a TCP packet.
Nice. Okay. Was it like 12 or 14, I think, for UDP?
I don't actually remember. 8.
8, even better.
Yeah, less than half for the header size. So, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, you can send everything through UDP, and then you can have your own reliable UDP packets if you need them for only the reliable stuff, and then have everything else be non-reliable, which can be a lot of stuff. It doesn't necessarily just have to be positions, right? It can be
you can send, so you send everything unreliably, right? So even a death message that you want to get there reliably, you still send unreliably. It's just, if I haven't heard back from the guy in a few packet traversals, then maybe I resend it. Or maybe I resend it every single tick because this is really, really important until I get an acknowledgement back. So you get per message control on your server for how you want things to be sent with UDP. because you're implementing that reliability.
Right. And then the last question on here, which was really just a follow-up to his previous one, which I think I may have already kind of answered, but I want to know if you know any good simple UDP client and server code example or sample. Do you know of anything that uses eNet or libgrin that like
yeah,
a tutorial site or a sample that has like how to implement this at a basic level?
the eNet has basic client server examples. It doesn't include position stuff.
Is it more like sending a hello world?
I think it's actually just sending a byte array, and then the server receives it and it echoes that byte array back. It's like even simpler than that, but I don't think so. Lidgrin also has example echo server setup. That would be called as an echo server. It's just I don't think there's anything Unity specific that I can think of, or that includes something that would be considered like gamey, like sending a position or something like that. It's all just here's a string or here's a couple of bytes, and it goes over like that. But I'm talking like the GitHub page for Lidgrin has that, and then the GitHub page for eNet has that echo server example. And I think the eNet one actually has a Unity example too, if I recall.
Seems like a good place to start.
Yeah.
Somebody else asked, I don't know if you happen to have it available just in chat. They were asking about the Steam or the Valve article.
Oh yeah.
Do you happen to remember the link to that? I've seen it a million times, but I couldn't pull up the right one if I went and searched for it.
Yeah, it's Source Multiplayer Networking. I Googled Valve networking.
There you go. That's the one. Go check that one out if you're interested in that. It was really good. I remember reading it a couple of times. I don't remember all the details of it at all because that's why I had to read it multiple times. But
yeah, this is if you can consume all of the content on this page and understand what it's saying, you're well on your way to understanding almost everything about complex FPS networking.
Can you pull up the eNet GitHub too?
Sure.
Show people what that looks like. Because if you search for eNet, there are a lot of things that show up.
We're using NX right there's fork, or NX right here.
Okay. That's funny. That doesn't even show up as example. That's like way down on the list for me on Google. eNet C#. There you go. Cool. Okay, we can jump back over to questions. I just want to make sure people saw the link for it. So you just search for eNet C# and you'll see that.
It's a really simple echo server here for the server and for the client.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's probably a great example to get started with too.
Yep. I mean, this is basically what we've built everything on top of is sort of this example.
Perfect. Okay, let's see. I'll jump back over to the other form and start. The last one was just a very nice comment and thank you on there. So jump back over to the other form that had some more questions. Okay, the next one is I worked on a high school project where two players could throw rocks at each other. The ground around them would break and reveal power-ups like fireballs and bombs. This took me a good while to work out with UNet. My main problem is I could never get it to get something to work on the host without breaking the same thing on the client or vice versa. If I changed setup so that it wasn't a network game and split screen, everything worked fine. We're asking for general tips or patterns to avoid breaking things when whenever you're changing stuff. Sounds like he's making a change and it would constantly break on one side or the other, and just keep it's more like seems like more of a synchronization.
Does it sound like this was? It's breaking because he's having to do a build. Like, is that the kind of breaking that you're talking about, or do you think it's in terms of like not even a network project, where it's just like code architecture where you make a change in one side of the project and something else breaks on the other side of the project? I
think it sounded like it was a network architecture thing where things were getting out of sync.
Okay.
That's the way that I read it, at least. I could be wrong, but that was my understanding. Like, in just a matter of how to keep things in sync. So like you blow something up and a thing spawns, you basically spawn a power up on the server. How do you go about replicating that cleanly without breaking things?
I think server is king is the easy answer to that. It's the client should be asking the server to do something, and the server should be doing it on all clients that are interested in this object. So if I want to do damage on the client, in a single player game, it might be as simple as like shooting a gun, doing a ray cast, finding the thing, and then doing the damage to that thing, right? But in a multiplayer game, that damage needs to be acknowledged by the server and then propagated out. I can't, as a client, do the damage locally and then ask the server to do it, because you'll lead to a desync there. Maybe the server determines that, oh, you didn't actually hit that thing, so the health shouldn't have gone down. Is that, do you think that's kind of the thing he's getting at?
Yeah, and I think it might be that it was just reading it again. I think it might be that he's got different code on the hosted client. The server is also a client, right? It's
right.
And that he's handling things differently for when it's a remote client versus a local client. So would you recommend just making sure that everything goes through that same path on the hosted
share the
client
code
too?
For sure.
So that it's still running the same thing, like that one's still basically sending a message to itself to request stuff?
Yep, I think so, yeah. Yep, I completely agree. That's for sure the approach you'd want to take there.
Yeah, I can see that getting out of sync if you do it differently, like for the remote clients and the local host client. Just make sure that local host client is acting like a remote client in everything that it does, and it's not doing anything different than the other clients. So it's kind of a hard one to really get into, I think, without seeing real code. But I think that sounds like that's what the problem is.
I think to sum it up, you want to share as much code as possible in terms of simulation, so that you can see the same things happening on different instances of the game. By sharing code, that is almost a guarantee.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, the next two I think are ones that you already hit. What are thoughts on networking with Mirror? You liked it, recommended
good
it.
Stuff. Yep.
And then thoughts on and tips on using Photon in Unity. I think if you just go back, we've answered that, I think, in detail quite a bit. And let's see, I read one more before I...
Wait, did we went back up? Weren't we down? We were past some of these already, weren't we? Yeah, silly question. How do multiplayer update games?
That explains why we already answered them. I just bounced up to that one, apparently. That's what
I think we skipped that one because I don't remember that one specifically, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. I'm just reading through, trying to find here. Let me read one that's really quick.
I think this one right here. I'm clicked on. I think.
Yeah, it's long. I'll read through it and summarize it. Let's go down two more. What would you recommend to keep up with the state of the art and pick ideas to apply for your specific project? So, what would you recommend to keep up with, like the newest networking trends and newest high-speed networking stuff for your game?
Well, I watch Microsoft's C# developer conferences. I don't know if that's a little bit dry, but that's one way. And then I just consume a lot of YouTube content as much as I can. But that's really it for me. I stay up to date on all the newest language features that I'm interested in. And then whenever I have time, I just consume content. Yeah, whatever I can find it.
The same way. I like to watch not just game related stuff, I think, kind of like you were saying, but also just C# things in general.
Oh, yeah.
Get the new features and new stuff that's coming out. Also use Writer so that it will recommend a lot of those things to you.
My God.
They'll say, hey, there's an easier, cleaner way to do that. Hit the button.
What a fantastic way to learn new language features. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. It's super, super important. Tell everybody in my courses now to just use Writer, and I do only Writer stuff in there now.
It makes sense. It's a great way to learn. You get exposed to the API better, and you get to learn new features of your language, like little bits at a time, so you actually remember it.
Yep. And I like how it tells you when you're doing something wrong. It'll actually give you a link to an article that explains why it's wrong and what the potential issues are, instead of saying, hey, just fix this.
Yeah.
And if you're a student, you can get it for free. Somebody mentioned in there. Definitely worth grabbing.
Or if you're a teacher or any kind of educator as well.
Oh, yep. Yeah, I actually got to give it away for free to my students too, which is really cool.
Nice.
They're freaking awesome, man. So I read through that question, and on 26, the question comes down to, what do you do when you're in like a worst case scenario? You're building an MMO and 500 people decide to jump on top of each other in the same spot and start dancing around and doing all kinds of stuff. Are you usually CPU bound there? Are you network bound? Is there like a trick or something that you would do to deal with
most
that many
games
people?
would be CPU bound and bandwidth bound. If you can keep things efficient, you can remove the CPU bound part. If you can develop efficient enough netcode and you have good interest management, you can avoid the CPU bound part, but the bandwidth part you're not going to avoid. And that's where you need to gracefully degrade your network send rate. Eve is a good example of this, where as more people are in the same area, the actual tick rate of the server decreases. So your cooldowns increase, how much damage that you can do decreases, how many actions you can do at any given point decreases the more players are in an area. It's just the server is essentially taking longer. It's intentionally taking longer to do these ticks. I don't actually play Eve, so this is secondhand knowledge. I might be a little bit off on it, but that's the idea, is the more people are in an area, the less frequent you need to be sending updates for each entity, because you can't afford the bandwidth. So your interpolation algorithms need to account for how much actual latency there is. And then on top of that, the server needs to be informing people of how much like added fake latency is there, because there's just too much going on in this area right now. And both of those combined, you can still do decent interpolation and extrapolation on your entities with that data.
Yep, that sounds like a good idea. And then you also, I would assume, recommend prioritizing like your targets and your group and
Definitely.
stuff like that, right?
Yep. This is where interest management can come into play, where the same calculations that you're doing to determine if something's in a cell with you or in your interest area, you can also give things priorities and say, the nearest things have the highest priorities to me, and then give arbitrary higher priorities to your group mates or your target, like you're saying, or maybe the boss that everyone's fighting. You can make sure that you're still jamming their state updates into every packet, let's say, and then other people are just being scattered around randomly.
Yeah, it's a good answer. It's a hard problem to deal with, too.
It's a very, very difficult problem to get done right, yeah, or to solve.
Cool. Okay, let's see. So the next one was, from what I understand, networking solution depends heavily on the game genre, which I think we talked about a bit. MMOs are way different from FPSs. Is there a general rule of thumb or starting point when there's no specific genre in order to design the ideal solution, like just a very generic one? I'm going to guess there isn't, right?
You can. It's kind of what we have. I would say you could use our library and develop anything really, but it's more of like, does the library support this really obscure feature that only this genre would be good for or not? So maybe you have a network library that you've developed that actually handles really complex things like doing lag compensation for hit detection across the network. Maybe you can build that into your library so that at your application level, you don't have to think about getting lag compensation done correctly in my game. You can get it done lower from your game, right? So there are libraries that exist like that. I think the F. Holmes Bolt initially, I think they were bought by Photon. That library was actually purchased by Photon, but that was an example of a library that was more game genre specific. It was better at FPSs than other things because it had things like lag compensation in it. And that would just be, it would be silly to do those kinds of computations for an MMO because it's unnecessary. You're not doing lag compensation in a tab target MMO these days. Right. So it's hard to say you could design a specific generic solution that works for everything. You could, but it would be lacking features that other genres could use, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you're going to do something generic for anything, it has to be peeled down to pretty bare level so that you can implement those more genre specific features on top of it. Because once you've done that, like your lag compensation library is going to fall apart completely in an MMO.
Right. And it's no longer generic enough, right?
Exactly. Yeah. As soon as you're specific, you're implementing genre specific stuff, you're you're out of that generic land.
Cool. Okay, we got a couple more, but first I'm just gonna ask everybody again to hit the like button and the share button and the alert thingy, just so we can get more people in here, get more questions and stuff. Still got a bunch of them to go through. A lot of them are duplicates though, so I think we're gonna be able to pick up the pace and go really fast through a bunch of these. Also, again, if you had any special questions that you want to get bumped to the top, or just to say thanks to Kyle, you can send in a super chat. I'm sending all that over to Kyle when we're done. And probably some extra, because I really appreciate this. This is really good info. Let's jump through the next ones. How do you develop client server games with Unity? I think you've kind of already talked about that. You recommended trying out Mirror as a good starting point if you haven't done any before. And I think that's a good enough answer, unless you had anything to add to that.
Symlink, that's it.
Symlink?
Yep, Symlink. Get 2 projects opened, 2 Unity editors open for 1 project using a Symlink of your assets directory, and work that way. Don't do builds.
It's a symbolic link, and it lets you have 2 copies of your of the same project open, because that issue is that you run into with you open a Unity project and you're working on it, and then you want to test it and you want to have your client and server running at the same time. Setting up that, if you just search for Symlink or symbolic link in Unity, you'll see examples of how to do it. I think I made a video or 2 on how to do it. But it's very, very important. Good catch. I totally didn't even think about that. You want to be able to run your client and your server and debug and test both at the same time.
Yeah, builds will
really important.
Eat time.
Yeah, you don't want to have to sit there and do builds and then try to debug one thing at a time. That's nightmare. And I'll have multiple instances of things copied over.
Yep.
Yeah, it's huge time saver. And you don't want to be copying your code back and forth and making sure that it matches.
Right.
Okay. Do you think there's a case for using sockets and or middleware over higher level plugins in game development? I think you already said yes, right? Like, you recommend, ideally, in a perfect scenario, writing your own. Otherwise, a low level library or something that's not just throwing in a plugin for stuff.
To iterate a little bit more on that, I wouldn't recommend actually doing custom UDP implementations. So I would pick a mature UDP library and build on that.
That makes sense, yeah.
So I would build your application layer from scratch. So like the UNet layer or the Photon layer, I would build from scratch, like the part that's actually in Unity.
Right, not the part that's doing the UDP packet writing.
Exactly, yep.
Okay. What do you look for when comparing middleware solutions? I mean, I think you just look for the different types of game that you want to build, right?
Yep. Pretty much, and maybe some performance characteristics. Like if you're going big on an MMO, maybe build a nice little soaker application and send 100,000 strings. Just see what happens.
Right. Okay.
Where does it fall apart?
Testing them out and trying them and see what works and what doesn't before you build the whole thing on top of it. Right?
What are the memory characteristics like? Yeah. What kind of CPU usage am I hitting? Does it actually send all the data? Pretty important to know.
Yeah, that's a very important one.
Yep.
How bad is it to use TCP and UDP at the same time? We talked about that a lot, and it's not.
Nope.
Right. And would you recommend Photon Bolt? I think you said yes.
I just talked about that. That's funny. Yeah.
Would you create a dedicated server, or should the player be the server?
It depends. Yeah. If you're doing a casual co-op game, make the player the server. It's way cheaper.
Way easier to work
way
with
easier.
You.
Oh yeah, way easier.
And if you want something competitive where you're worried about people cheating or you need lots of players on there, you got to go with the dedicated option.
Yep.
And then there was another one about some Unity talks, but the links were bad, so we couldn't actually check it out.
Yeah.
If you got those again, you submit them, just drop it down. But the links are truncated, so we can actually see them. Let's see. Answered questions from beginners, students, bosses trying to get a handle on different project architectures, peer-to-peer, thin client, rich client. Maybe you could give a quick once-over on that, explaining when and why to use each separate type. So when to use a thin, like when to use peer-to-peer or client server, push-pull type thing. I guess this is more for mobile, I would say. I don't know. Push-pull. I'm not sure how to answer this one, though. I don't know if you have...
Trying to get a handle on different networking project architectures. Well, I guess, yeah. So I can talk about peer-to-peer versus client-server a bit, I guess.
Sure. I think that's useful for everybody.
peer-to-peer would probably be, I mean, it's not that popular these days to do anymore. Just because it's so easy to hack and you can't deal with it. There's no route to deal with hacking at that point. I don't actually have a ton of peer-to-peer experience. It's more of a hobbyist level for me. All of the actual professional work that I've ever had to do is always client server. Whether it be a backend as a service or my own service or server that I've done, it's always client server. But thin client versus rich client, I have more experience in, because you could think of that as authoritative and non-authoritative. So like a thin client wouldn't have the capabilities of doing a full simulation tick to predict the future, right? So a rich client or a thick client, I think they're also called, has to have enough of the data to do physics simulation locally, right? So that's
like
another,
FPS.
yeah, exactly. Or even an FPS like Counter-Strike or something. You're predicting your own physics into the future and then reconciling that prediction with whatever the server ends up sending you, right? So that's an example of a rich client that has to exist for an authoritative server to actually work. I don't think I can really talk too much about peer-to-peer these days. It's just not very popular anymore. Even player-hosted games aren't really very peer-to-peer anymore. There's a central authority. That authority is just a player, right? The clients aren't able to directly talk to each other, or they don't even know what their IPs are, really. Only the host of the game would know. And that's still, in a sense, client-server architecture. It's just the server is a player. Right? I don't really know.
Like all of the clients are communicating with each
other. Exactly, yeah. You can send a message. Any client can send a message to any other client. It's like a mesh, the web connections.
Or they'll broadcast out to every client.
Exactly, yeah.
It's just not safe usually.
It's not safe at all, no.
It's not very reliable either, because you never know what messages made it to what system.
Yeah. I mean, Skype suffered from this before it was purchased by Microsoft. It was a peer-to-peer platform. The entire implementation was peer-to-peer. So if you got onto a Skype call, a group Skype call, you were exposing yourself, your public IP address to everybody there. So if you were doing competitive gaming back in the day on Skype, you get into a group call and you're getting DDoSed because you're playing with people that want to win really bad, and you just expose your IP address to them.
That's a very good point. Yep.
Right.
Okay, I think the next question was a pretty good one. Which said, I'm making a mobile multiplayer game that requires a server, and I'm looking for a freelancer to help. What skill set should I be asking for? Says networking knowledge is slightly above 0. So if you were like looking to hire a network engineer for your Unity multiplayer game, what kind of things would you ask about, questions or?
What a good question, man.
I thought that was really good.
Is
there anything that stands out? This is again for a mobile game, so I assume it's going to be.
I would want to see examples for sure, like of what they've done. So I'm trying to approach this as if I had no networking knowledge. So like putting myself in his shoes, and that would be really difficult, because a lot of the things that I would be looking for, you wouldn't be able to evaluate without having networking knowledge. Because it's going to be hard for you to know if what you're looking at is good or not. Because like if it works, that's one way of evaluating it, right? But getting networking working for small numbers of objects or players actually isn't that hard. Skill really shines once you're trying to scale networking. That's where the difficulty comes in, and how to prioritize what bandwidth, what am I using my bandwidth on at any given point. Right?
So you'd want to see like an example in
large
that type
scale
of genre or something?
Yeah, okay, that's true. Yeah. So if you're talking about building a smaller scale game, this isn't, it doesn't matter that much. You just look for an example of working networking, I think would be enough. If you're talking about building something big, you're going to need some examples of really large scale networking and working locally. Like, can he build serialization and packet creation systems that are efficient enough to deal with hundreds of thousands, like a factor of 10 larger of what than your game needs, really, because you're going to have to factor in gameplay code and all of this other stuff that's going to be happening in there too. That would be something that I would really want to see is can, even in a local sense, like a local running server, a local running client, can we get close to like a factor of 10 or even more things on screen being serialized? If that's possible, I would be probably pretty comfortable saying that he knows what he's doing.
And then if you were, so say you had an example like that and you're able to load it up and test it and you can see all that stuff going on, you can see that they've got the 10x, the entities moving around or whatever they are. Is there something that you would look for bandwidth wise or in the profiler for memory allocations or something there that you would want to
definitely
to see if it's an issue?
Garbage allocations should be near zero in Unity. I think there's room to introduce some garbage allocations for one-off gameplay code things like instantiates and things like that. But per frame, generally, if you pull up the profiler, the GC alloc column should say 0, always, forever. If that's not the case in your game, I would look maybe introducing some pools, some object pools, or maybe looking at converting some of your frequently created classes over to structs. Anything that you can do, just moving things around or caching, reusing, pooling to get that GC alloc column as close to 0 as humanly possible.
So yeah, you're testing out that network layer. You want to make sure that it's not allocating. Of course, there's allocations at the beginning when it starts up, but
for sure,
frame to frame, you shouldn't be allocating anything in that network layer.
Yeah,
or very, very little at the most.
If you're allocating on that network layer, that's going to propagate to everything else, and it's just going to cripple your performance.
And then what about bandwidth wise? Are there like just
that
numbers you recommend on like just say it's like a 4-player game? There's something you would recommend there?
It depends on the game, really. Like, so if all of your NPCs are implemented in sort of nav mesh agent type form, like using some sort of a pathfinding solution, then you can reduce bandwidth quite a bit by not having to sync positions. You're just syncing current position, destination position, how long it's going to take for me to get there, etc. And then if the path recalculates, then you change that data around. So it depends on how the strategy that you're using to synchronize this data. If you're synchronizing lots of rocks tumbling down a hill, then you're sending raw velocity, position, and rotation data. Maybe you can compress it a lot, but it's inherently a lot more data to send that than it is to send an NPC doing a pathfinding algorithm, right? So it's difficult to give an exact bandwidth target, but you can do some simple math. There's the n squared networking problem that it's sort of a generally understood problem. It's you have one player, he hits his bandwidth, that's it. You have 2 players, it's not just double the bandwidth, well, it is in this case, but if you have a 3rd player, it's not just triple the bandwidth from one player, it's exponentially growing for the more players, because you have to broadcast to everybody. It's not just this one person that I'm adding to. So you can do some simple math, exponential math, by determining how much bandwidth one player will use, and then using the n squared algorithm or idea, you can just extrapolate how much bandwidth your game will use if you know one player's bandwidth.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. It's a good answer to the question. The next one was about setting up network services. Like if you're, so say it sounds like they're considering using a third-party service, but they're worried about costs and stuff, and they're wondering about setting up their own one. Is there are there any technical issues like firewalls, scalability, auto scaling, or security stuff that you just would recommend or talk about? I don't know if you have anything there.
Just don't host the server in your closet, pretty much. Like use Amazon or something like that. They've got any kind of feature that you could want for security. And if you want to be a little bit cheaper, there's other similar cloud hosting services that work almost identically to Amazon's services that you can save a little bit of money on. you might sacrifice a little bit of capability or functionality in terms of what they have and what they offer in their backend and how their services work together at Amazon. But if you just need VM hosting or some sort of virtual machine or dedicated box, then any of the services out there will have everything that you need to deal with. Pretty sure. Firewall, scalability, security, it's all covered.
Yeah, and it's not too, I mean, you got to know a little bit about the services and firewalls and stuff and auto scaling, but it's not too complicated. And there's a lot of resources out there if you're using AWS. Also, if you're doing it on AWS and you can make your servers a Linux build, you can save a lot of money too. Cost just drops like in half because you don't have to pay for the Windows license.
And Unity works out of the box on Linux. So no reason not to.
Yeah, it's definitely a good idea to get that going before you start worrying about scaling up too much, because you're just going to cut your costs like in half.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's read one more, and then I'm going to blab a little bit more, which is making a multiplayer chess game. How do I get each player to control their own pieces and sync transforms? And I think this is going to vary just based on the library you're using, right?
Yeah, definitely. I would just to answer it without talking about libraries, just I would have a single piece that the server acknowledges each player has. So the player can click a piece. It'll send a request to the server, say like, I'm asking to pick this piece up. Server will say back, okay, that's fine. And that's it. Now you're dragging this piece and the server just acknowledges any of the movement and reflects them.
Right. And you wouldn't give them like client authoritative game objects for each piece, right?
No, but you maybe you could for a chess game. Actually, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. But in terms of picking it up and moving it around, I don't think it would be that bad to have that be a client authoritative. But the actual piece dropping and saying like, I am putting it in this spot. This is the square that it is in. And I'm acknowledging this is my chess move. That needs to be authoritative for sure.
Yeah. Server authoritative, you mean?
Server authoritative, correct, yeah.
You just have like, I mean, I think in most situations, you'd probably end up just having a player game object for each one of these that's sending the messages back and forth and saying, hey, I want to move this piece ID from here to here or whatever.
I think that would be just fine.
And then on their client, they can just check, you can allow them to drag the piece on their client if they want, but make it do the check that it's their piece, like that it's marked as their piece on the client. And if they cheat in memory when they try to drop the other piece up, it's going to say, no, you cheater, you can't move it. But when they do it,
just probably snap back to wherever it was or something like that.
Yeah. Then you can just minimize those messages even more. It's a good one. Anyway, I just wanted to blab one more time. I don't know how long you wanted to go. I was figuring we'd probably end in like 20 minutes or so, keep it around 2 hours. But if people have questions, I don't know that we're going to make it all the way to the end. If you guys have questions you want to bump up to the top, feel free to send a super chat. All that's, again, going to Kyle just as a thanks for jumping in on this and answering all these questions. And we're going to try to go through them as quick as possible. There's also the form there. We'll try to get through them, like I said, as fast as we can and just answer them. And I'll stop blabbing. Oh, don't forget to hit like and share and all that too, because I want to get this up to like, I don't know, 500 likes or something. We're only at 117, so if everybody just hits it like 3 times, we should be good. Okay, let's jump on to the next one. How do you deal with server authoritative actions? Can attack player, can move to location? I think we just kind of answered that, right?
Yeah, I mean, he kind of answered it in his own question. So you have can attack player. I mean, that's literally what you ask the server.
So like, I want to request attacking a player, and then the server either does the attack or it replies back and says no, right? Or can try a request move to location or something. How do you handle server-side prediction of the client location versus server-side reality and minimize rubber banding?
Well, the first step is running the exact same code with the same inputs and having a physics library that is reliable. That's the first step, and that's really hard to do. So that's not a trivial thing. PhysX is not going to produce the same result identically down to the byte level, given the same inputs on 2 different machines, especially if one's like an AMD and one's an Intel. You're almost guaranteed to not have the same output. That being said, you just need to deal with that. You need to have robust client rewind and input resimulation. So the client is going to be storing all of the frames of input in its history in a buffer. And when a server detects a desync, it will send back the frame or the tick that desync happened on and the current state of the player, the client, and the client will just set itself to that position back in history and replay all of its queued up inputs. Now, the resulting position that the client resimulates is probably going to be a little bit different than where it started. The trick is to determine the difference between those two. So the delta between its current position and the new position that it just resimulated, and smoothly move that distance. Don't just apply that resimulation in one frame. Recalculate the new proper server position and integrate to that position slowly. So you're still going to be simulating. It's hard to explain in words. There's two simulations on a client happening. There is the simulation from the recorrected position from the server and the simulation happening from wherever the client thinks that it is. And the difference, the delta between those two positions is your integration distance. So you're slowly moving yourself from wherever you think the client is to wherever the server says that it is. You never do that snap instantly, but you're always simulating from where the server says the player is supposed to be. God, it's really hard to put into words, actually, thinking about it.
Is there a good article on this?
No,
Oh.
not at all.
Like one?
The Valve one is as close as it really gets. But this is like really, this is more fine-grained implementation details of what it's talking about. It's the client is always predicting into the future and sending its state to the server. And the server does the same simulation with the same inputs. And if those states are different, the server sends the correction back, right? And at that point, the client snaps back in time and resimulates back up to its current time, replaying inputs, essentially. The trick is when it does that snapback and resimulate, the position that it ends at and the position that it started at might be a little bit different. The difference in those positions, you just need to smoothly move towards. You don't want to instantly snap the player to that newly simulated position.
And you just want to interpolate that over
it's
some number of frames?
It is interpolation, but it's also, it's like a moving interpolation. So like that position that you're interpolating to is still constantly going to be changing because you're holding W on the keyboard and running, right?
Okay,
does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're simulating where you are now, doing your inputs for that. And then you're also simulating from the position of where you were corrected from the server, but then still interpolating towards that simulated position. It's like you almost have two players at the same time.
Okay. I think that's a tough one, but
it's really hard to explain, actually. I think some visual, maybe we could talk about this a little more, and this would be such a good video, actually, because I think some visual assets to go along with the explanation helps a lot in this. In my head, I can imagine what it looks like, but it's hard to put into words.
Cool. Yeah, let's consider doing that. If you guys want to see a video on that, leave a comment and hit the thumbs up button again. or leave Kyle a super chat and he'll be super inclined to do it. Right. Let's jump on to a couple more. So the next one was, do you think Spatial OS is a viable solution? You already said it was, that you'd be played with it. Heroic Labs is open sourcing a network solution called Nakama. I've had this recommended multiple times. Have you tried it or heard of it?
I've had it recommended to, actually not recommended to me. I've heard of it on forums and I've seen other people recommend it, but I've never used it. I have virtually no knowledge of it other than the name.
Okay. Well, we'll skip that until we know more about it. What's a crucial part of a VM or server? Do I need more RAM or CPU or network speed? Where do you focus there?
Depends on the game. So something like a voxel Minecraft world would need a lot of RAM. Right. Something like a physics-based
more CPU.
Yeah, or like a physics-based like sword fighting game, like combat kind of sword fighting game, that's not going to need much RAM at all. It's going to be almost all CPU.
Yeah, makes sense. And then like an FPS would probably be focusing more on
mostly
network.
CPU.
You think CPU or network?
Some network.
Oh, okay.
It's going to be a lot of CPU because of the lag compensation. So the hit detection in FPS is pretty expensive in computation.
Cool. Yeah, and it's a profile it too, right? See where your bottlenecks are, and then adjust. You're never going to guess right the first time.
And it's going to be different from game to game, so you have to profile it. Yeah.
What's the process for launching a game with one of these solutions? So they're using a small CCU plan and it works fine in dev, and they don't know how to scale it out to like a large scale thing. I think it's kind of recommended going to
like
AWS.
Photon Cloud kind of thing is what they're talking about. I would assume it's like Unity networking or Photon Cloud. They're like
sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah.
My guess is it's probably Photon or something.
Yeah.
Or Unet.
Photon is a more obvious path of upgrading because you can switch to Photon server and run your own servers at that point if you ever have to scale up.
Yeah.
But if you're using like Unity networking, I guess you could still do that with Unet. Yeah, you could still do that. It's.
So you
I'm
want
not
to
sure
make
how
sure
to answer that necessarily.
If you're expecting a large number of players, make sure that you can scale fast and easily. That you can scale up really high and over provision at first.
Yeah.
And then that you can scale back down when you've gone too far over, because you don't want it to be expensive. You don't want your CPU or your servers running at low utilization.
Yeah, that's true.
But you also want to be able to scale them up quickly. Otherwise, you're gonna
like the Amazon Elastic services, right, where you can instantly scale. If you somehow blew up on a Friday one weekend and got 1 million downloads in one day, having something
ideally,
in place,
you can make it auto scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Goes up with use and goes back down.
Yep.
And that's pretty easy through Amazon. I say it's pretty easy, but it does take some knowledge and some practice and experience figuring it out. But you spend a week or two, you can get it figured out, I think.
Yep.
How to predict resources for certain type of user. I think you already mentioned that. Just was it the network?
N squared. Yep. You can Google that. It's a pretty common thing.
Yep. How might we track entities in a larger world game? And load them up on the client when they're close enough to see. You already answered that with a cell graph or just
2D grid, quad tree, or octree, something like that.
Yeah. Network pooling seems like a way to control your NPC, but I can see time ghosting, or when I lose sync of the various clients. What's the best way to? I'm not sure I understand what that is.
Worst if I create and kill NPC all the time.
This was on 48. Oh, yeah. I'm not sure I understand what that one is.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand either.
Well, let's skip ahead just for time.
No
worries. This one's about Oculus Go networking issues. I don't know anything about that. I assume you don't know much about Oculus Go networking.
Mm-mm.
I haven't played with it really at all. Best third party. You already mentioned that. Mirror was your recommended if you're not building your own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We already answered the networking solution. Okay, this one I thought was kind of interesting. So they're talking about a game like Dwarf Fortress, which has hundreds of thousands of tracked entities with simulations that run over every entity. But then now they're saying add 100 multiplayer or 100-person multiplayer, and you can visit other players' settlements. So it goes from like a very simple thing, because if I remember right, Dwarf Fortress is more like a turn-based, right? It was like a roguelike where everything's updating every time you do an input.
Oh, is it? I assumed it was real time. I didn't know. I've watched some Dwarf Fortress. I didn't actually know if that was
turn-based. I wasn't sure either, but I thought that's what it was. I guess I haven't played it, so I'm not completely sure. And I think that running the simulations for single player obviously is pretty simple. Doing that on a 100-player multiplayer, I have no idea. You got any ideas there other than keeping the simulation state on every client? Oh, somebody's saying it's kind of a God game. So I guess it's not what I was thinking. So it's more like a God game that runs at a constant time step.
So the server is going to be doing a lot here. The client is going to be a glorified renderer. I think in a case like this, where you're only going to be wanting to sync the result of these ticks on these entities. So an entity might tick. Say an entity ticks, but visually nothing really happened. because he didn't move he's still in, say, like, I don't know, a drinking state, right? He's maybe a guy sitting at a bar in a drinking state. Tick to tick, his state isn't really moving that much. He might be playing an animation to indicate that he's drinking, but really his serialized data that's driving him is not really changing that much in terms of what the client sees and what state that he's in. He might be server side, he might be ticking a lot of stuff, like how much longer am I going to be in this drinking state? Am I gaining health back because I'm in a drinking state, or mana, or whatever that might be? Lots of stuff is happening server side. Not that much is actually happening client side. So the delta of the data that's changing is not that much. And that comes back to interest management again, where you need to keep relevant sets of entities available for the client. The server needs to know what a client can see so that the server can send only relevant state deltas to that client. And I think this is the same sort of problem that you would have in a normal MMO.
That makes sense. Yeah, and you just only send the stuff to people that are around it.
Exactly.
Got to keep the server authoritative. That sounds good. What's the when? Oh, I like this one. When is the best time to add online functionalities to an online game in development?
Day one.
Yeah.
You got to do it from the ground up. Yeah. You can't. It can't be an afterthought. Like Jason said, it's
harder.
10 times the difficulty. It's way worse than 10 times the difficulty if it's not something that you're conceptualizing in your head from the day one. Yeah. If you're building a single player game with the idea of, once the game's done, I'm going to go back and add multiplayer to it, you're making a single player game and then you're making a multiplayer game. You're not making a multiplayer game. It's going to be additive difficulty. It's not going to be easier.
Oh, it's going to be dramatically hard. I think people see like Carmack did it with with games way back in the day, right?
Yeah, well,
they're like, oh yeah, but
if you're a super genius, it comes with the territory.
Yeah. A simpler game and you're super genius, then
yeah,
and you're the only one working on it, and you've got the whole code base in your head, then sure.
Yep.
But for any normal person out there, you got to start multiplayer day one and work on that. As soon as the project's real, like as soon as it's a real thing, like doing.
It's got to be built from the ground up to support networking.
Totally agree. Is it possible to create a whole server in Unity using the no graphics directive build?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yep. That's what people do all the time.
Yeah, more than just possible. I would say probably ideal if you're doing physics in your server at all.
Yeah. And it's one of the easiest ways to get going.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips on handling incorrect player inputs using authoritative server? Especially interested in the case of frequent events like player movement, where by the time the server realizes the data is incorrect, new movement data might have arrived from the same client.
This is what I was attempting to talk about. Yeah, that needs to be a video.
Yeah, I'm going to skip a couple more of these because they seem, they're all things that we've hit before. And if you guys are wondering, you'll be able to go back and just watch all the way through and find the answers to a lot of these questions. If you see us skipping over any of them, it's because we already answered them here. Where do I begin to start learning how networking works? Like you said, go play with Mirror or Photon or something. That is a good starting point.
Get something in your head, just something that you want to make, and just start playing with it.
Start building a project is always the best way to do it.
Or something, just simple.
This one was, would you say it's possible for a single developer to make a networking library for Unity without having experience in about a year? I'm going to guess you would say definitely, right?
Yeah.
Like
really
handles 20 people.
Oh yeah. The basics of networking, like once you wrap your head around what's actually happening, you're just sending bytes to somebody and they're taking those bytes and turning them into something. Like the basics of networking can actually be extremely simple. And if you're doing it in your own library, it becomes obvious how simple it is because you're not reaching into some black box just to hope that something works. You can just tear it apart. And that's why I think people are a little bit scared of networking, is because all of the recommendations are go pick up this library. And this is how you use the library. This is how you create a server. This is how you create a client. And they never get deeper than that. When if you look underneath that library, it's not actually doing that much. It's like doing it yourself, unless you're talking about a really advanced library. But most of the lower level UDP socket libraries, dead simple.
Yep, they're very, very simple. Yeah, I would definitely look at that. I mean, just dive into that, and like Kyle recommended, try that eNet example that we talked about earlier. Somebody was asking for solid resources. I think we mentioned quite a few already. How do you deal with damage that a player can cause to other players? Oh, okay, yeah, we talked about that too. Just making sure everything's server authoritative. Send the message to server, request it, and then server will tell you what to do.
And the other part is, do you broadcast it to all players or just those in a specific range? Just those that are in a specific range.
Oh, yes. I don't know. I mean, I think you broadcast it to whoever's in that cell graph, right?
Yeah, or in the cell graph or a neighboring cell graph, maybe.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, in the cell or a cell around, which is, I guess, an important thing to mention when you're talking about using these grids. You almost never do like only the people in the grid. The grid box that you're in, you do the surrounding 8 too.
Yep, generally.
So that way you see everybody in your box and everybody in the boxes around, ideally, unless you need to rein it in because there's too much going on.
And then your view distance is just determined by how big these cells are.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you can do multiple. You can go out further if you want, but let's see. In a MOBA game, they want to sync AI coordinates. I think you talked about that, just sending down the path and the position and letting the clients move them. Right.
Yep. Definitely. And you might get a little desync in the nav mesh agent position during the pathing, but generally not a big deal. If it is, then you can send more corners, right? You can send more path data to the client.
Makes sense. Somebody asked if you'll get back to streaming one day.
Who asked that? That's funny.
I don't know. We could dig through and find out. Oh, actually, I didn't save anybody's name off, so I don't know. They want you to stream though. Why delta state compressed rather than compressing delta state data, or compression other than RLE? It's pretty hard to delta between compressed streams, isn't it? Do you know what that means?
It's not hard to, I do understand what he's saying. So if your data is very random, so generally compressed data is maximum randomization or entropy, right? So I think what he's saying is, if you don't compress your data and you're doing delta compression, if you're delta diffing two states, if you don't run compression on the states, it'll be easier to delta compress them because they'll have more similar data potentially, I think is what he's saying. It's just not the case in my experience. You hand pack your data as small as you can get it. Just in general, like your inputs and things like that, you want to pack down as much as you can. But delta compression, the big wins you get are from 2 frames, just nothing changed. That's from tick 1 to tick 2. If nothing changed, then it's just a no changed flag, and that's it. That's where the delta compression really shines in my book.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. When you explained it, now I understand. The next question was about, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but they're asking about whether or not they should do their server build in Linux, which I said yes, but then they go on to talking about using a LAMP stack, which is not, it's a whatever, Linux, Apache, Mongo, PHP. And they have a different Unity project for the server. So I think what we generally would do is probably just use a Unity project for the server, but he says it's like a Pokemon Go type game, in which case I could see the argument for using like a web stack for the backend instead of a Unity server, because
I would only use the Unity server for physics, really, I think.
With a Pokemon Go type thing, you're really just sending requests up and down and getting that. You don't really need there's no benefit to having Unity in the back end there. So I would say you're fine with what you're doing there. And then your thoughts on pair programming, Kyle?
I think it's extremely effective when both people are developing new things or working on something that they haven't done a million times already. It's valuable to have the flow of ideas just pouring from both people. I love it.
I 100% agree.
I think it has its use cases, and it has times when it's not as good, especially when you're developing something more simple that the programmers have both done a lot of times, I don't think it's nearly as valuable.
Yeah. And I think it works best when people have a somewhat close experience level and skill level too, where everybody's able to contribute. But it's even good if they're not on that level, and you can kind of do it sometimes to just help get people kind of matching on level, or just mixing skill sets. Some people are just better at one thing than another. If you're pairing on those things that you're not as good at, you'll learn them, and you'll teach them to the people if you are better at them.
Yep.
What forums do you recommend for intermediate level programmers? I have no idea. You got any?
I mean, I frequent the Unity forums. I like Reddit. I like the Unity subreddit, the game dev subreddit, and the programmers subreddit. Both greats, or all three of those are great.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. What do you recommend for sending non-game state data, like client connection requests and other similar control events? He's talking about he's found using RPCs and other stuff, but wondering if there are better techniques for regular UDP game state messages.
Sure. I mean, if you're doing your own library, I think a good way of doing sort of a handshake, at least, is allowing your library to, allowing the client to send some sort of a key or a hash along with their connection request that the server can interpret as being good or bad. That's one way. But I think the more general question is non-game state. I think an RPC is fine. An RPC or some sort of a built-in message in your UDP library, it's just fine.
Totally.
There's no the thing you just want to flag your client if it's if they need to be authenticated or sort of I don't know what you'd call it, like logged in, I guess, before they're allowed to send other states. You need to have that be like a Boolean on their peer object saying that they're not authenticated yet. And then if you receive a message from them, if the message is not the type of message that you were expecting, like a login message or an authentication message, you just instantly disconnect them.
Yeah, that sounds right. Don't allow the messages to come through if they're not. Yeah, if they're not in the right state for it.
Yep.
Okay. We only got a couple more questions.
I'm good to get going.
Try to tear through them. You can get up to 150 likes at least, though, before we answer the last 20 questions. Okay. Oh, yeah. Let's just jump into the next one, which I thought this is an interesting one. And they're just talking about how to go about with mobile games that aren't multiplayer, but they store some state like your score and your coins, and that stuff is stored on the server, but the data is really coming from the client. And how do you have any tips on how to validate that the data that they're sending, like I got 10,000 gold from breaking this thing, or my score was whatever from matching all these letters or whatever? Like, do you have a good idea of how to validate those?
If it's coming from the client and you're not running any server simulation for the game to validate that score, I don't think it's possible. At least not that I'm aware of. It's very, very, very hard.
Some sanity checking to make sure that it's at least within the reasonable bounds and that they're not going outside of the maximum that know is possible, right? Like if the max score that you can get on something is 10,000 and they're saying that they got 3 million, just say no.
Yeah, that's obvious. Definitely.
Like there's not a lot you can do though if you're not doing any validation on the server. It's pretty hard to keep it steady or keep them honest. You mentioned that you've used Spatial OS. We talked about that a bit earlier. Just go ahead and rewind and you'll be able to see all that. Are there any specific design patterns to use for networking in Unity? I don't know.
I mean, all the solid principles really apply. Like all the standard networking, all the standard programming stuff that you hear people tout about, just as applicable in networking, keeping things single responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Open close. You don't want to have to be jumping into classes just to modify a little thing. Like you want to have things just as extendable and maintainable as normal code. It really is just normal code that executes on another machine.
Yep. And keep it clean and simple.
Yep.
And easy to understand ideally. Okay. Regarding security, what encryption would you use? SSL, TLS, RSA for data transfer? What bit size for security keys? How would you implement this on a client server network game architecture?
I mean, I don't encrypt vast majority of the data that goes through a UDP socket library. All of the sensitive stuff happens outside of our socket library. So things like account logins, character retrievals, and things like that. That doesn't happen in our game code. That happens in our world server, which is not a part of our UDP system or our socket library. So I actually don't think we send any encrypted data over socket at the moment.
No, it's usually just that for the login, you encrypt the login data, and that's about it. Obviously, don't send passwords.
Yep. Yeah, we don't actually send, I don't think we send any login information or passwords. Any kind of data like that gets sent over our sockets at all.
And we don't really encrypt anything. I've never really found a good use for it. Encrypt the data that you're sending up to the client, because they're just decrypting it on the client anyway. And most of the time when people are hacking stuff, they're reading memory. They're not even getting to the point where they're looking at the network traffic. And some people are, but the majority of them, the easy route is just looking at memory. So if I want to become a serious game programmer and dig in deeper to networking and game development in general, should I go immediately low level and start learning C++ in order to make my game using a custom engine, or should I stick to using Unity? I know what I would answer this. I'm going to let you take it.
It really just depends, honestly. If you want to make a game, if you're more interested in making a game, I would go with Unity. If you're more interested in learning C++ and making an engine, I would go with that. So like it depends on what your draw is in what you would choose, what interests you more.
Yeah, most people I know want to make games and they want to work on games. They don't necessarily want to build game engines, but I have at least a couple of friends who they don't really care about making games. They just really like the idea of making new game engine tech. And like,
see, I'm right there, man. I'm like that, except I like playing around with network stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't care if I'm making a game or not. If I'm making a library, I'm having a blast.
That's too funny. Yeah, I feel like, hey, I guess you're one of those friends, right? I'm like total opposite, and I just like making video games and not so much the engine stuff and the low level stuff. I enjoy it, building it, and I guess I liked it a lot more back in the day. But now, like, I just want to get to the gameplay stuff, the gameplay code, and make things that people can play. But it's totally. I think they're totally different skill sets. But
yeah, I think it's just a difference between, do you want to be an engine programmer or do you want to be a game programmer? And they are different things.
Yeah. And if you're just looking for a job, there's way more game programmer jobs than engine programmer jobs.
That's true.
For sure. And the skill set is going to transfer, I'd say, a little bit better. I'm thinking like when you work on custom engines at bigger companies, you get very focused on like their specific tech. If you want to go work at Unity though, or Unreal, definitely like learn C++ without a doubt. But if you want to just make games, then just use an engine and then decide, you change your mind. You can always learn both. It's not too hard to jump from one to the other. So it's not like
if you're interested in engine development, by the way, check out Handmade Hero, please. It's my secret indulge. I love this guy. KC this is some of the best YouTube content I think that exists. And it's been going for years. 574 episodes now of building a game engine from scratch in C. So it's great if you're interested in that.
That's really cool. Yeah, definitely go check it out. Subscribe, watch them. Okay, since any client code is hackable, we need to run our games on a server to have an unhackable game. Is this true? Yes.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on using RackNet as a network library?
It's old, but works.
Okay. Is it a good approach to send and receive data as JSON string while coding games? Probably not.
No, I would only ever do that as a fallback. So a lot of times you'll have binary protocols that services can communicate over. But if there's a version mismatch between these services, they can fall back to a JSON serialization, which is easy to interpret on the other end, even if you don't have all of the data in your format. So the only way I would use JSON is a fallback for serialization.
Yep. Or if you have to work with some external service that requires JSON for some other type of stuff like player leaderboard data or something like that. But yeah, you're just sending a bunch of extra string data for no reason. most of the time. If UDP is just as good as TCP when you're out of your own reliability, then why would anybody use TCP? Because TCP
Less
is
work.
so heavy.
So you don't have to, it's just less work. If you don't have to implement a reliability protocol, then why do it?
If you can get away with the performance characteristics of TCP for that stuff, you're totally fine. Or if you can just use it for the side by side, and it
just
makes
think
sense.
like World of Warcraft is built on TCP, so
yeah,
it's fine. If you don't need it, it doesn't matter.
The ML API.
Yeah, mid-level API. 210, I think, made that, right? Yeah, I've checked it out a little bit. It looked good. I think it's a little bit overdone, and I think some of the serialization's a little silly, but it looks very well done. It's another alternative to Unet, very similar architecture to Unet. I think the claim that it could be better than Mirror is true in a sense. I don't think that it has as much support, though. That's my opinion on it. I think it is probably ultimately faster than Mirror in performance. I would be willing to bet. I haven't tested it, but based on the implementation of it, it looked a little cleaner in that sense.
By the way, people were mentioning in chat that JSON data is easier to debug when you're doing the networking. And I think you kind of lightly glossed on being able to switch back and forth between binary and JSON data. So definitely. That you could do that debugging if you wanted to, right? You can switch your serialization over to JSON mode, and then you can debug it and then switch back to binary once you figured out the problem, right?
Definitely.
That's a relatively easy job of just swapping out the serializer. Do you recommend using bit packing or less precise floating point values for networking?
Oh yeah, wherever possible, especially when doing when serializing state to the client. It's almost always worthwhile to serialize compressed data because you generally can't tell the difference on the client. So, for example, in Pantheon, we send a compressed position based on the zone that you're in. So a city might have more compression than an open wilderness area because there's more people. So we send a compressed position in that sense, but we also send a compressed rotation for your heading. So it's only a single byte indicates the direction that you're facing, and then a single byte indicating the direction that you're moving. So we don't send any actual full rotation data at all. In that sense, it's all just bit packed and compressed data, or less precise floating point values in that sense.
Nice. And that's funny because one of the next questions was, what are some strategies you use to employ for lag compensation on Pantheon?
Oh yeah, I mean, we do entity interpolation. We have synchronized time. We plot positions onto a spline, and then we evaluate that spline based on the current time, and that's for players. For NPCs, it's just navigation agents. There's custom nav meshes and naving and sending the starting and end positions, the corners essentially of the path that gets generated. And we know velocities of NPCs, so we can predict where they will be at any given time. So we have synchronized time, so we know at what point in time they're supposed to be at a certain corner in their path, so we can make sure that they're there. And that's really it.
Yeah. I mean, those are all good little strategies to use, I think.
Yep.
Definitely the stuff you want to do. Let's see. Could you make unit tests to test networking features in your game so you don't have to test hand by hand opening 2 builds of the game?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the library that we have now, you can run an arbitrary number of servers and an arbitrary number of clients in a single Unity instance. So it's fine to write test code around this by just creating a server, creating a client, connecting it. Like you can do it all in line in one function with the library. So as long as your library supports opening and closing an arbitrary amount of servers and clients in a single executable, it's very easy to test. Yeah.
And I don't know if most of the, do you know if like Photon or Mirror would support that?
I don't. Unet did. This was called host. So there was like server mode, there was client mode, and there was host mode in Unet. And host mode was actually just a server and a client running at the same time. So I'm pretty sure that Unet supported it. I can't say for sure about Photon or any of the others though, or Mirror.
Okay, I wasn't sure either. So, okay. Let's see, what else was there? Hi, Kyle. If I wanted to be in your shoes working for an ambitious MMO, what steps did you take to end up where you are? What is your dev story?
Wow. I dropped out of school. I took a job. Actually, I dropped out of school and took a job working with this guy.
Yeah.
That was fodder, actually, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago.
And then since then, you just kept building games, right?
Yeah, really. I haven't been full-time AAA employed every day since then. I took time off to do Twitch streaming, make my own stuff. I've always just had my hands in some sort of a project, be it personal or a client's project or something that somebody else was working that I thought was cool. Like for Pantheon, for example, Jason was talking to me about it. And I was like, that sounds like a cool project. I'll do some work. I joined for free. I wasn't even going to get paid. I was just going to have some fun and work on a cool project and hang out with my buddy. But it turned into more than that. So I would say just enjoy yourself. If you're having fun programming, just make sure that you're working on something and continue growing and learning. And stuff just kind of falls in.
Just gotta keep at it, right?
Yeah, it's something. If you stop programming, you're gonna lose a lot of the skill. Like it goes away. It's a constantly evolving and changing thing. So if you're not staying up to speed with it, then you're just getting left in the dust.
I'd say at least code a little bit every day, or
yeah,
almost
at least
a
little bit every day. Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely not the kind of thing that you can just, I coded, 3 days a week and
yeah,
you're
it's not
doing
a part-time
it like all
thing.
the time. But make sure that you're enjoying it so that it's
Yeah.
not like a hard task to do. You should really love it and have fun doing it at the same time. Yeah. As for working on MMOs, just start applying, right? Build up a little bit of skill set and just start applying and start trying. Just get out there as quick as possible. The sooner you get onto a project, the sooner you'll be able to learn all of the things that go into working on a AAA project.
And most of that knowledge you pick up on the project too. It's not something that you can learn in school or pick up from a YouTube video.
There's just nobody that can teach it, right? Like
no, it's
too
not
much
teachable.
to learn and too much to know, and you're never going to know all of it. Like you're going to know various parts of whatever the project is when you get into a bigger AAA project.
You'll never feel ready either. You'll never feel like, oh, it's okay. I'm good. I'm prepared to work on this AAA project. Finally, like I've picked up the knowledge. You'll always feel like it's just out of reach until you finally just say, screw it, and you apply, like Jason said, and you get the job, and that's it. Now you can finally start learning. You won't be able to learn until you get that job. Really, you'll never feel like you're ready because you can't get that knowledge until you have the job.
Yeah, I felt totally unprepared and like I had no idea what the hell I was doing. When I got my first AAA job, I was like, I don't know how the hell I got here or why I'm here. But like, I just really liked working on this thing and was just in and having fun. Somehow they thought I was good enough to work on it. And
imposter syndrome everywhere. Like that's you can't avoid it really.
Yeah, and I learned a ton working on the job. I mean, I learned all my programming on the job and dicking around. Like there was no formal stuff at all. My formal training was in electronics, which is 0% useful for me. Like it was all just working and trying to figure things out and finding problems and then trying to find solutions to those problems, just searching online. Now, I mean, there's so much info out there. It's really easy to find out everything that you want to find out. And we're almost to the end of the questions. If anybody else has any other quick questions before we wrap it up too, the form is linked in there. Also, you can still send Kyle a super chat for the next, I don't know, a couple minutes before we wrap stuff up, and we'll answer those too. And let's get, I guess, the last 3 questions we got. What would you recommend setting up? Oh, I think we already kind of answered this, except for DDoS protection. Do you have any suggestions about that? So he's asking what you recommend for setting up security layer like TLS or RSA. I think we generally use TLS, whatever 2 or whatever the latest one is, but I don't know much about it. But what about DDoS prevention?
So everything that I've done in DDoS prevention is at the service provider level. So like Amazon deals with it. I've never had to actually implement any sort of custom DDoS anything for anything ever. So websites, we just deal with Cloudflare, and for game servers, we've left it up to the cloud provider or the dedicated server provider that we're using.
Yeah, I've done the same. Or we had network engineers who were really responsible for managing that stuff and making sure that it wasn't a problem. And it's not part of the game code or anything. Are dedicated servers on the way out? I'm going to say no.
No, definitely
Not
not.
at all. Dedicated servers.
Even cloud servers are still dedicated in a sense.
Yeah. So would you actually have Unity running the game on the server in a client server architecture?
Yep. In a lot of cases, yeah. If you need PhysX, specifically PhysX, not physics, but PhysX, then yeah, I would. If you're doing custom physics, so if you're implementing Bullet or you're doing physics calculations yourself, potentially, I would rip Unity out of the equation and do your entire dedicated server in a console app. Right? There's no sense in having the overhead of running an entire game engine if you're not making use of those game engine features, and generally being physics or PhysX.
Yeah, your physics system or the navigation system, I guess.
Yeah, that'd be another one.
Yeah, you can build your own. It just depends. The other thing I was going to note too is that I know they're working on making the physics system swappable. I don't know what the state
I've played with it a little bit. Yeah, it's available now. You can use Unity Physics, which is their stateless ECS-based physics solution, and you can also implement Havoc now as well. So
okay, were any of those usable for that? I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, well, do you mean in like outside of Unity, sort of like a console app?
Yeah.
Okay, no, all three of those I believe have to be used in a dedicated.
Okay.
Yeah, headless server environment. But you could use Bullet, you could use Havoc, the library outside, like the non-Unity Havoc. You could use PhysX, the non-Unity PhysX. Like there are actual libraries that exist as well with these physics engines that you could use in a console application. So you don't have to use the Unity implementation of them either.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'd say if you're just getting started with it and you're not sure what to use, just start with Unity and then work from there and meet the requirements that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let's see. You mentioned regarding Dwarf Fortress that you should only send the final data of the simulation to the client, but I feel like Jason mentioned earlier that you should utilize the clients for simulation as much as possible. Wouldn't 100 people at 1,000 entities be a ton of server cost if it's all handled server side?
Yeah, it would be. But there's the client simulation. You utilize the client here to do prediction. Like that's generally why a client has simulation data, and why you use them for simulation is because you can predict into the future. If you have all of the ingredients that make up a simulation, the client is able to then reliably tick ahead of the server and assume what's going to happen based on previous states. And that's important for things like an FPS, where when you hit W on your keyboard, you want to immediately get that feedback. You don't want to wait for a round trip time for your character to start moving. That's why a client does simulation. In the case of Dwarf Fortress, the client wouldn't need to do any extra predicting or simulating because there isn't anything to predict or simulate. You're simply playing, you're like watching a video of what the server is processing. And that's far less to compute than doing prediction into the future for all those thousands of entities and then state rollback when the server disagrees with how you predicted the entity. That make sense?
I think so, hopefully.
Okay.
I assume whoever asked these are in the chat still because he's right at the bottom. We had two last ones here, or three last ones. One just popped in. Can you guys recommend a hosting provider? I think Amazon was the one that was recommended. I use DigitalOcean for some web
I've
stuff,
used both of those.
Yeah,
so I can recommend both of them.
Yeah, I'd say it's the same. I like them both. And then is Pantheon data-driven or ECS-based?
I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
I don't either. And it's definitely not ECS, though.
Yeah, there is parts of it use the job system and one part of it uses ECS, but everything else is mono behavior, standard, Unity.
Object-oriented, right?
Object-oriented.
May have been kind of more, it's very data-driven and object-oriented.
Yeah. The game is entirely data driven though. Yeah.
And then any book or tutorial recommendations for C++ server?
Sorry, I've got nothing for you there.
I got nothing either. Cool. I think that's the end of all those questions. And
Beautiful.
this was a lot of fun. I
Yeah,
learned
for sure, man.
a lot. I think hopefully everybody else did. If you guys did learn something, make sure you hit the like button and share and all that. Yeah, and leave a comment if you have more questions. We'll definitely do some more streams and maybe a video on that networking stuff we were talking about. Just drop a comment below, and if there's enough of them that can bribe and entice Kyle, we can jump in there and do a full video on how to handle network state stuff. I'm not sure if it's just like 5 of us that are interested in it or everybody thinks it's really cool. I think it's really cool. And again, thanks everybody for joining, especially thanks for Kyle. That was really
No worries.
great.
Glad to be here.
Appreciate it a lot. Had a blast. Cool. Hey, you got anything you wanted to say at the end, Kyle?
That's it, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, cool. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it. And see y'all later.
Take care, guys.